let's talk about the 4 basic chords that we can have. And when I say basic chord, triads, because there needs to be 3 tones so that we know what it is. And as mentioned before, if I have 2 tones, if I only hear these 2 tones and nothing else with it, I'm not sure if it's part of C major or if it's part of A minor. So it's really important to have a context. And what I mean by that is you need that 3rd tone to really say, hey, this is a major chord, or actually, this is a minor chord. So the first type of chord that we'll talk about is a major. And I'm going to continue using C major as the example because, again, the scale of C major has no black keys, and that makes it a little bit easier to visualize on the keyboard. So a C major chord is going to be made of C, skip 1, E, skip 1, G. C, E, G. I can play as many as I want, and it'll still sound like a C major chord. So to break that down a little bit, we could come up with a bit of a formula. Chords are made up of what we call intervals, and an interval is the distance between one sound to the next. In a major scale, from this tone to this tone is called a third. And why? Because it took 3 tones to get from the bottom one to the top one. And we always include the bottom and the top tones when we talk about intervals. So a chord is actually made up of 2 different thirds. We've got a third on the bottom and a third on the top. But from the bottom key to the top key on a piano, or bottom tone on a violin to the top tone, is what's called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a fifth. So knowing that a chord is made up of a third and a fifth is basically all we need to know to figure out our chords. So the first type of chord is a major, and the deciding factor why it's called a major is actually not to do with this fifth here. It has all to do with the third, because this third is part of the major scale of the bottom key. This fifth, it's really interesting when we talk about major and minor scales because the fifth is always the same. If I were to play C minor, G is still G and C is still C. But if I were to play C major, it has a completely different sound, but I'm still playing C and G. So the one tone that changed it from happy major to sad minor is that third tone. So the interval of a third. This is what tells you if a chord is major or minor. Completely different tone. Now, when I mentioned that you can't get a chord from 2 tones, this is what I mean. If I've got this interval of a third here and then I add the fifth, I've got a major chord. But if I turn the root of this chord, and when I say root, just like the roots of trees, it's the bottom of it. Without those roots, that tree is going to fall over. You need the foundation. You need the roots of that tree, or in this case, that chord, to tell you what you're really playing. So the root in C major is C. But if I were to play a third down here, so now this is my third. This has that sad or minor sound to it. and then we add the fifth on top, now I have a minor sounding triad. To change that, I have to mess around with the third now. So in A major, if we use our formula, skip, skip, we find that we actually have to play a C sharp to get the major sounding triad. So the difference between major and minor triads, and I'm going to use the term triad now because that is our simplest chord, is that middle tone. So you can play around with that middle tone to get major and minor sounding triads. But what if we start messing around with the fifth? Okay, so what we talked about earlier is that in a major scale, the root and the fifth are the same as if you were to play the minor scale starting on that same key. Now, it's not relative minor. That's totally different. This is a totally different key. You'll find that if I play C major or C minor, the first key and the fifth are exactly the same, but the one that changed is the middle. So what if we start messing around with the fifth? What if I stretch it? So now I went from this type of a fifth and I moved it higher. So we've got this stretchy sound. Well, if I play that first happy sounding third, we call it a major third. Major, you can just think of it as the happy sound. And then I do a fifth that's stretched above, I get another type of triad, and it's called augmented. Augmented chords are really neat because if you break them up, you can add a mysterious type of sound to it. Now, what if I play that stretched out fifth, but I drop this third? Interesting. This actually sounds happy again. Do you know why? Because if I take this top tone and I throw it down here, I'm just playing a major triad again. So when you mess around with the fifth and you keep that third major, so you end up actually having a major third and a major third together, you get what's called an augmented triad. But when you drop that third, then you're just playing another major triad. So far, we've talked about major triad, minor triad, and then from major, if I stretch that top one out, I get what's called an augmented triad. There's one more missing piece here. And that is, if we go back to the minor triad, and then I take that fifth, so from the C to the G, but I take that G and I squash it down. So now I turn it to G flat. Ooh, now we have a very dissonant sound. And when I say dissonance, it's like the sounds are fighting each other. This is called a diminished triad, and if I play a diminished chord, there's a lot of tension. So if you want to make up a song and you want a little part of it to be very kind of spooky or tense, something's going to happen, then you can go, and then people are like, oh, what's going to happen there? So there are 4 types of chords. Now the way that I think about the 4 types of chords is really squished to really stretched out. So the one that's the most squished is the diminished chord. And why is that? Because not only is that third squished, but the fifth is also squashed down as well. So you get a diminished chord. And then after that, we stretch that fifth out, but we keep the middle one the same. You get a minor triad. And then from there, we stretch it out again, but we don't stretch out the outward tones, the first or the fifth. Now we're stretching the middle one. Now we get a major sounding triad. And the final piece is when we stretch the outside out, and then you get an augmented triad. So from the smallest, just so that you can hear the sound, to a minor, to a major, to an augmented. And I love that type of change. That's called minimalism. So when you're just changing a little bit at a time, then you will get all these interesting sounds. And that's where it gets really fun, where you can start improvising your own music and playing around with sounds. So that's why I strongly encourage just experimenting. Play different chords. Start here. Oh, interesting. That's got a cool sound. Well, that sounded like it's super squished, so probably diminished. Oh, that's happy. That's major. Let's start here. Wow, that actually sounds stretchy. Augmented. Oh, that's really squished. The tones are really close together. Diminished. So you've got the 4 types of chords. Please mess around on the keyboard. The best way to do it, like let's say you want to start on this key. You're going to call it an F sharp. Just pretend you're playing F, figure out your basic chord, and then mess around with things. So now you can turn that to F sharp. Oh, what do you have now? Well, that's diminished. Okay, stretch out that fifth. Minor, stretch out the third. Major, stretch out the fifth. Augmented, and then you can play with the different sounds that way.